I'm Josh Larky, and this is the Dominator. I'm going to be going over some Underdog Fantasy season-long pick-em lines for the upcoming 2024 season. There might be some pickup lines in here as well for the folks that like to date. I'm just kidding. Let's get right to it. I'm going to discuss the higher lower picks that I like and my reasoning behind it, along with just the general landscape of this market by position. We're going to go over the quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end, and defensive player markets for this. It is all an Underdog Fantasy. We'll start with the smallest market tight end, Travis Kelce. His receiving yards high-low is listed at 1,065. His receiving touchdowns are listed at 8.5. I would lean lower on both of these. He turns 35 in October, but it's not a strong lean. And we really don't have a whole lot of information right now on the Rashee Rice situation that could affect things pretty heavily. Kelce did have at least 1,125 receiving yards in 5 straight years, which would have been at least 60 yards better than this line. But then he only had 984 yards last year. He dealt with some injuries, probably some age-related decline. He has at least 9 touchdowns in 4 of his past 6 seasons. He had only 5 last year. Overall, I'm not touching either of these lines, but if I had to, I would just lean lower on the 1,065 yards and 8.5 receiving touchdowns. Now let's go to a more interesting market, quarterback. I'm going to list the menu of options from highest to lowest passing yardage. Then I'll discuss the picks that I like. Patrick Mahomes is at the top, 4,350 passing yards, 34.5 passing touchdowns. Those are what is listed. But right below him is Dak Prescott, 4,225 passing yards. That's the only thing listed for him. 125 yards fewer than Mahomes. We've got Josh Allen. He was at 4,200 yards. It looks like they are plucking him currently now that the Stephon Diggs trade went down. Kirk Cousins at 4,100 passing yards. And they also have him listed at 28.5 passing touchdowns. CJ Stroud is off the board, but yesterday when I looked, obviously Stephon Diggs trade happens. They got to pluck Texans and Bills players. CJ Stroud was at 4,050 passing yards and 26.5 touchdowns. Below him is Trevor Lawrence at 3,999 passing yards. No pass touchdowns number for him. 299.5 rushing yards, 3.5 rushing touchdowns. Jalen Hurts is below him, 3,675 passing yards. And they also have him at 11.0 rushing touchdowns. He's had double-digit rushing touchdowns each of the past 3 seasons. I believe that is the first time it's ever been done at the quarterback position. 3 more guys to discuss. We've got Baker Mayfield at 3,650 passing yards, 23.5 passing touchdowns. Lamar Jackson, 3,600 passing yards, and he's also listed at 770 rushing yards. And Bryce Young at 3,150 passing yards, 18.5 passing touchdowns. Let's discuss 4 of these players more in depth. And folks, at the end of this show, I will reveal my favorite high-low pick for the good people and outline why history is begging us to take the lower. Anyway, the first one that caught my eye was Kirk Cousins. 28.5 passing touchdowns feels like a very, very high number. Because it is. There have been at least 6 quarterbacks each of the past 4 years with at least 29 passing touchdowns. That's good for Cousins. 6, that's there. At least people are able to do it. On average, there's been 7.5 per season over the past 6 years. In 9 years as a starter, Kirk Cousins has at least 29 passing touchdowns in 5 years, which is a little more than half. But I lean under. He plays with Bijan Robinson. That's a very, very strong touchdown vulture running back where they're likely to feed him carries near the goal line. Kirk Cousins is coming off an Achilles injury. That's concerning too. The way I see it, if this has roughly gone higher or lower half of Kirk Cousins' seasons as a starter, then putting him in a new environment where he has to develop chemistry with his receivers, and he's coming off the Achilles injury, and he's in his late 30s. I think we should be leaning pretty heavily towards the lower than 28.5 passing touchdowns. CJ Stroud is now off the board. We'll see if he returns. I leaned very heavily to the higher on his 4,050 passing yards. At least 8 quarterbacks the past 6 years have reached that number. An average of 10 per season have hit that. He had over 4,100 passing yards in just 15 games last year as a rookie with at times a heavily injured receiver core. He also just attempted only 33.3 pass attempts per game last year. And that number could definitely go up because it ranked just 16th at the position last year. Normally, I lean lower for season-long lines. This is the rare exception where I think it's just simply far, far too low. Now with the dig straight, of course, this is off the board. I think if it opens again, anything below 4,200, I would be taking the higher on that one. Lamar Jackson. He's listed at 3,600 passing yards. His first 5 seasons, he had no more than 3,127 passing yards. That's well below 3,600. Fortunately, last year, though, he did have just over 3,600, 3,678 passing yards in 16 healthy games. We're going to lean lower here again. If Lamar Jackson was fully healthy last year in a great passing offense and he cleared this number by 78 passing yards, he misses a couple games due to injury. The offense is just not quite as good at passing the ball. There were also so many running back injuries last year. They now have Derrick Henry, and I think they're going to feed the big dog. Just a lot of things that can go wrong here for Lamar Jackson, fewer that can go right. We are going to lean lower, 3,600 passing yards. The last one to discuss, I don't have a play here, but I just want to talk about why Bryce Young at 3,150 yards isn't this slam dunk higher. Now, at first I thought, Bryce Young needs only 3,100 yards. He just got Deontay Johnson. He's going to start the whole season because he was the first overall pick last year. So I looked, and 3,151 passing yards has been hit by at least 15 quarterbacks each of the past 10 years. On average, 18 per season over the past 6 years. That's not as many as you'd expect. 18 per season the past 6 years. I'd say Bryce Young in a situation is comfortably outside the top 18 right now. That doesn't mean that I'm taking the lower on him. It's a pretty small number. I think if he stays healthy, there's a good chance he goes higher. But this is why, to me, it's not the obvious higher that some people might think when they say, he just got Deontay, he's going to start the whole season. Let's slow down. Now, before we get to the running back market, where I have several plays that I like, let's get some quick words from the Podfather.
Now, I know many of you are looking for a secret weapon for your Dynasty League, and I have it. It's called the Dynasty Dominator app. You go to the App Store, go to Google Play. It's right there. It's $5 to download, and then every year it's $5 to load the next incoming class of rookies. You can add Superflex, add tight end premium. It's incredible because it allows you to look up players. It allows you to vote on whether a player is a buy, hold, or sell, and then see the market sentiment on that player. And you can compare their lifetime value rating from PlayerProfiler to their Dynasty ADP at the FFPC, all in the price lookup tool. And beyond that, we have a trade analyzer, so you'll never lose another Dynasty trade again. And in our settings, you can set this is a win now team, this is a rebuilding team, and then we let you compare players. Look at their metrics side by side, prospect metrics, NFL metrics. It's all there. It's $5 in the App Store. There's some add-ons for Superflex and to buy the upcoming rookie class. Every year, you're going to spend $5 on this thing, and it's going to be well worth it.
It's also well worth it to talk about some running backs. If we sort by rushing yards, I see 7 running backs that are currently listed in this market. Christian McCaffrey, 1,150 rushing yards, 10.5 rushing touchdowns, 500 receiving yards, 5.5 receiving touchdowns. Those are the numbers they give you. Saquon Barkley's right below him. 1,125 rushing yards, 7.5 rushing touchdowns. So Saquon's 25 rushing yards below McCaffrey, 3 touchdowns rushing below him as well. Josh Jacobs is third. 1,000 rushing yards on the dot, 7.5 rushing touchdowns. Derrick Henry at 999 rushing yards, so 1 below Josh Jacobs, 10.5 rushing touchdowns, same as McCaffrey. Zach Moss is at 850 rushing yards, 6.5 touchdowns rushing. DeAndre Swift is also at 850 rushing yards with one more, 7.5 rushing touchdowns. And then Tony Pollard rounds out the market, 800 rushing yards, 6.5 rushing touchdowns. I would like to discuss 5 of these players more in depth. We'll start with Christian McCaffrey. Christian McCaffrey is 28 years old. He's topped 1,150 rushing yards in just 2 of his 7 seasons, 2019 and last year, 2023. Fewer than 5 running backs per season reach 1,151 rushing yards over the past 6 years. Fewer than 5 each year do that. He has topped the rushing touchdowns in 2 of his 7 seasons as well. That's it. Out of those 2, I would like to lean lower for both the rushing numbers for McCaffrey. I prefer the yardage. He can get kind of lucky with touchdowns if he plays half a season or a little more than half a season. 1,150 rushing yards is a lot for a 28-year-old running back with a long injury history. And then in the receiving area, he's had more than 500 receiving yards in 5 of 7 seasons. Wow. I didn't quite realize that until I actually looked. His receiving stats are incredible. However, he has only had higher than 5.5 receiving touchdowns in 2018 and 2023. So 2 of 7 seasons. I lean lower on 5.5 receiving touchdowns. That is so many receiving touchdowns. Most years, only 1 or 2 running backs reach a number like that. McCaffrey himself has only done it in 2 of his 7 seasons. His incredible 2019 season, where he really broke out for fantasy football, guess what? He didn't even get 6 receiving touchdowns that year. That's just very hard to do. We're going to take the lower on his receiving touchdowns and rushing yards. Derrick Henry, let's be more positive. His numbers at 999 rushing yards. He's had at least 1,059 rushing yards 5 of his past 6 seasons. He had 937 rushing yards in 8 games in 2021, the one year he missed this. The Ravens running backs have been so efficient with Lamar Jackson. I've talked about it on previous Dominator shows. They always average around 5 yards per carry. Henry himself has at least 10 rushing touchdowns each of his past 6 seasons. He's had at least 12 rushing touchdowns 5 of his past 6 seasons. Gus Edwards just had 13 rushing touchdowns. I would lean higher for Derrick Henry, 999 rushing yards and 10.5 rushing touchdowns. I prefer the rushing yardage one very, very slightly if I had to choose out of those 2. I think Henry's in a great spot. Yes, he's 30 years old, but PFF had him with a 90 grade last year. That was one of the highest among all running backs. Next Gen Stats thought he was incredibly efficient using player tracking data. All signs point to the big dog is still one of the NFL's best running backs, and that's a very low number for someone with a history of high usage and results. Back to the negative, Saquon Barkley. So his numbers at 1,125 rushing yards, I would lean lower. He's had 1,300 rushing yards 2 of his 6 seasons, but he's had 1,000 or fewer in the other 4. And I think one thing we have to remember is that players get injured, especially at the running back position. So you might think, oh yeah, of course, a healthy Saquon Barkley on the Eagles, he should have over 1,125 rushing yards. Should. I think there's still a slight chance, even if he stays healthy for every game, that he doesn't reach this. The team just lost center Jason Kelce. I think there's just a lot of factors going on here in terms of how much work they're going to give Saquon per game. And Saquon has long injury history. We will simply lean lower. I guess a good example, actually, DeAndre Swift was very healthy last year. He didn't even hit this number. Swift wasn't a great running back last year, but still, I mean, come on. Healthy Eagles running back getting a ton of carries each game and still couldn't reach that number with fairly good yards per carry as well. 2 more at running back, Zach Moss. Moss had a career-high 794 rushing yards last year. Before that, he was under 500 rushing yards his first 3 seasons. It's pretty unclear to me what the Bengals do at running back in the NFL draft, but they probably take someone. If we look at Joe Mixon with Joe Burrow the past 4 years, Mixon the past 4 seasons had 3.6, 4.1, 3.9, 4.0 yards per carry with Joe Burrow these past 4 years, which means that if Moss is going to have 850 rushing yards, he's going to need over 200 carries most likely. That's just a lot to expect from someone who has never done it at the NFL level, who has a backup running back contract when you look at the amount of money. So while I like Zach Moss as a later round best ball pick, we are allowed to go lower on his 850 rushing yards. I would recommend it fairly strongly. The last pick would be DeAndre Swift, taking him lower than 850 rushing yards and lower than 7.5 rushing touchdowns. DeAndre Swift is now on the Chicago Bears. If we look at his career, his first 3 seasons, he had fewer than 625 rush yards in each of those years. Remember, his numbers at 850 this year. Then he had 229 carries, career high. He stays healthy. 1,049 rushing yards last year with the Eagles. Swift had really, really bad advanced efficiency metrics as a runner last year. It's unclear what the split's going to be with the Chicago Bears when there's Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson there. I think Swift is the clear lead back. But I still think, based on how the touch split could go, that he could be below 850 rushing yards over a full healthy season. And then if we look at his rush touchdowns, which the number is at 7.5, he did have 8 as a rookie, so he barely went over this number. But he's had exactly 5 rushing touchdowns each of the past 3 years. I looked, 12 to 13 running backs every year reach 8 rushing touchdowns. 12 to 13, so about every 2.5 NFL teams is going to produce a running back reaching this. It's unclear to me if Swift's even the goal line back for the Bears. Probably. He needs to stay healthy. We've seen him stay healthy in previous seasons like last year where he still didn't reach this number. So we're going to lean lower for DeAndre Swift, 850 rush yards and 7.5 rushing touchdowns. Before we get to receiver and my favorite pick, let's talk about defense. The defensive market has 7 players in their sack totals. At the top, we have TJ Watt, 15.25 sacks. Myles Garrett, 13.75 sacks. Micah Parsons, 12.75 sacks. Recently extended Chiefs defensive tackle Chris Jones is at 11.75 sacks. New Texans edge Danielle Hunter is at 10.75. Recently extended Ravens defensive tackle Justin Madubuike is at 9.25 sacks. And now on the New York Giants, from the Carolina Panthers to the New York Giants, we have Brian Burns at 8.75 sacks. There's 7 of these players. I'm going to talk about 2 of them. The first, this is one of my favorite picks of the whole show, is Chris Jones. We're going to take lower than 11.75 sacks. Chris Jones is 30 years old. He's been lower than 11.75 sacks in 7 of his 9 seasons. He's been lower in 5 of his past 6. Why do we want almost a career type season from a 30-year-old? He rarely does it. I don't expect him to do it this year. So we'll just take Chris Jones lower, 11.75 sacks. And the other one will be, I like this one a little less, but I still like Justin Madubuike lower than 9.25 sacks. He's coming off career high 13 sacks in 2023. That's scary, but he had 5.5 or fewer sacks each of his first 3 seasons. So he had 5.5 or fewer sacks in 2020 and 2021 and in 2022. Then he has 13 in 2023. He gets extended. He's playing a position, defensive tackle, where there's just oftentimes fewer sack opportunities. And 9.25 is a pretty high number. He's only done this once. Let's see if he can do it again. I would like to root against that in Underdog Fantasy season-long pick'em. Now let's get to the receiver market and my favorite pick. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 receivers listed. Isn't that great radio for me to just count them up manually? Come on, Josh, you can do better. All right. At the top, we have Tyreek Hill, 1,425 receiving yards, 9.5 receiving touchdowns. CeeDee Lamb at 1,399 yards, 9.5 touchdowns. Justin Jefferson at 1,375 yards, 8.5 touchdowns. Jamar Chase, 1,310 yards, 9.5 touchdowns. Then A.J. Brown, 1,275 yards, 7.5 touchdowns. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 1,249 yards, 7.5 touchdowns. Mike Evans, the immortal receiver, 1,125 receiving yards, 9.5 touchdowns. Michael Pittman at 1,050 receiving yards, 4.5 touchdowns. DK Metcalf, 1,025 receiving yards, 7.5 touchdowns. 3 more. We have Calvin Ridley, 875 yards, 5.5 touchdowns for the new Titans receiver. Deontay Johnson, 825 receiving yards, 4.5 touchdowns for the new Panthers receiver. And Jerry Jeudy, 725 yards, 3.5 touchdowns for the new Browns receiver. There is one pick that I like more than any other on this show. It's Justin Jefferson. The yardage, I don't like. I think 1,375 receiving yards is a lot. But the one that I really, really disagree with is 8.5 receiving touchdowns. We're taking lower, and here's why. The past 6 years, an average of 8.5 receivers had at least 9 touchdowns. So we get an average of 8.5 receivers a year with 9 touchdowns, because his number's at 8.5. So we'd want 9 touchdowns if he's going to be higher. So 8.5 guys a year kind of do this at the receiver position. Good to know. 2022, there were only 7 that did it. 2023, there were only 6. The Vikings quarterback situation is a problem. It might be Sam Darnold. Or it might be a rookie quarterback like a J.J. McCarthy. Here's the problem with receiving touchdowns for someone like Justin Jefferson. Receiver talent really doesn't matter all that much. What the most important factor here in determining if a receiver is quote-unquote eligible for 9 touchdowns is quarterback play. I mentioned earlier that 13 receivers the past 2 years had at least 9 touchdowns. 12 of those 13 receivers were on teams with at least 25 passing touchdowns. 12 of 13 receivers were on teams with at least 25 passing touchdowns. 25 passing touchdowns is done by about 15 teams per year. There's 32 teams in the NFL, the 15th best team. So it's a slightly above average scoring passing game. I expect the Vikings to be one of the 5 to 7 worst passing games in the NFL for scoring, for yardage. And when we think about receiving touchdowns, primarily being an offensive team stat in terms of how good is the quarterback play overall, that is why my favorite pick, lower, Justin Jefferson, 8.5 receiving touchdowns. Let's review this one more time. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. We like Kirk Cousins, lower, 28.5 passing touchdowns. Lamar Jackson, lower, 3,600 passing yards. CJ Stroud, I liked higher than 4,050 passing yards. It has been taken off the board. Christian McCaffrey, lower than 1,150 rushing yards, lower, 5.5 receiving touchdowns. Saquon Barkley, lower than 1,125 rushing yards. Derrick Henry, higher than 999 rushing yards, higher than 10.5 rushing touchdowns. Zach Moss, lower than 850 rushing yards. DeAndre Swift, lower than 850 rushing yards and 7.5 rushing touchdowns. For defense, Chris Jones, lower than 11.75 sacks. And Justin Madubuike of the Ravens, lower than 9.25 sacks. And my favorite pick at receiver, Justin Jefferson, lower than 8.5 receiving touchdowns. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator.
From the Podfather to you, I deeply appreciate you tuning in. And many ask, what can I do? What can I do to help support the hosts, the research they do, the production costs? Go to PlayerProfiler.com, Dynasty Deluxe, World Famous Draft Kit, Rankings, DFS Dominator, and of course, data analysis. Subscribe to any one of those, and you support all of us and take Player Profiler to the moon.